Hold on, I gotta switch over to, oh yeah. They did change some of the, oh. So we're looking at 80% of the human food supply in the Amazon is produced by slash and burn agriculture. It seems difficult to imagine that this process is going to stop anytime soon. The idea that this agriculture, because of all the history and politics and incentives that this type of agriculture has had over the last century, almost a century now, it's ingrained in the culture and the thinking of the people that depend on this type of agriculture. Now, what is the problem with slash and burn agriculture? There's a number of them, and certainly important for you to know on the exam. First, obviously, when you slash and burn, you're producing CO2. CO2 increases, the concentration of CO2 increases in the atmosphere, and that has a positive feedback effect on the increase in the global climate. So that's one direct way of that slash and burn agriculture impacts the world. Now, the other thing that slash and burn, because you're breaking down the Amazon, you're also decreasing photosynthesis. Less plants, less photosynthesis. Obviously, you get rid of the Amazon rainforest. To any great extent, you're getting rid of a great deal of photosynthesis. Then, of course, that reduces how much the decrease. It reduces the absorption or the carbon sink that is the Amazon. What is a carbon sink? That's a place where the carbon is going to go. The carbon dioxide in the air normally would be taken up into the plants and made into plant material, more tree, more grass, more flower. But that is reduced, right, because of the reduction of photosynthesis, because you're burning down the plants. So what you end up doing is, in another way, increasing the concentration of CO2 in the air, but not in the primary way. It's because you're putting more CO2 in. In the secondary fashion, it's because you're not taking as much out. So the total CO2 in the atmosphere is equal to how much goes in minus how much goes out. When you do slash and burn agriculture, you're putting more in and less out, so you're doubly increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So soil degradation is another issue with the rainforest, and we'll talk more about it today in class. But the soil in the Amazon rainforest and any kind of tropical rainforest is millions of years old. So one, it's millions of years old. There are consequences to that. As with any system, the impact of any one thing is generally not isolated to one effect. So when you have millions of years old soil, that means there's a depletion of the nutrients in that soil. Well, why is that the case? Because of erosion, the soil being taken away by water, by by there being so many plants and animals that a lot of the soil is being taken out, but nothing's ever been replaced. So as you lose those materials to erosion and weathering, over time, the soil becomes less and less able to support any new life. What nutrients would, now, there's a quick question is why is this tropical rainforest such an exception as opposed to, let's say, the soil here in Ohio? Well, the simple answer is that the soil in Ohio has been impacted by glaciation. Now, what is glaciation? In the same time period, glaciation has impacted the north, the non-tropical rainforests, areas, like Europe, like the northern United States. And what it's done is it's brought in, it's reset, let's think of it as resetting the soil. Those giant glaciers, miles thick, plowed through, created the Great Lakes, turned up the soil, and allowed for new soil to be developed. And that's a big idea. It's one of those big ideas. So again, these are things that will be tested, right? So the next question is, what kind of nutrients are involved when we're talking about the nutrients in the soil? Well, old soil, at least in the tropical rainforests, are aluminum and iron oxide. So they're mostly rusted metal. Not very nutritious for plants. What's it missing? The soil is in desperate need of nitrogen and phosphorus for life to be sustained. Well, what is nitrogen and phosphorus used for? Well, what nitrogen does is it's involved in proteins, in nucleic acids, and you know these acids as DNA and RNA. And some forms of nucleic acids carry energy for cells, and they're known as ATP and the like. There's ATP, GTP, etc. These are the energy currency of the cells. And so without these key biomolecules, you can't have life. So there's little nitrogen in the soil can't support life as it had all the nitrogen that you have up here in the north in the soil. If you're with phosphorus, again, you need phosphorus for those nucleic acids. So nucleic acids are doubly hit. DNA, RNA, ATP, and the like are not able to be produced in as high quantity as one would like because there's not enough phosphorus in the soil to support that production by plants. Plants take that phosphorus out of the soil, make ATP, and then animals eat that ATP, and that enters the food web. So in this ecosystem, plants have an issue with what do they do to get these nutrients that they need? And over the millennia, these plants that live in this tropical rainforest have learned to conserve these nutrients. And what you find is that these nutrients in the rainforest are found in the plant material, not in the soil. So when you cut down the plant material or slash and burn it, and that material then erodes away because of weathering and the rain, no longer do you have the plant cover to help take up the water, to help maintain the ecosystem. The water runs off, takes with it whatever soil nutrients that were placed there by slash and burning, and especially if you're farming, because you're taking away those nutrients every time you harvest, those nutrients leave the system, but there's no nutrients going out. So to make an analogy to that concept of a system, if you have a plot of land, let's say it's 1 hectare by 1 hectare, that you're taking out nutrients without putting anything back in. So so eventually you'll run out. In fact, we know what the time period is for the nutrients to run out. It's about 2 years. It's about 2 years you have before those nutrients are run out. So then you have a choice. You either go and slash and burn more rainforest, or you go ahead and add fertilizer, which is, again, what is fertilizer? Fertilizer is nitrogen and phosphorus for the most part. Some other nutrients, but generally phosphorus and nitrogen is what's needed, the big elements that are needed. So you add chemical fertilizer. The problem is, of course, there's more than one problem, but for right now, let's talk about money. Money is an issue for the peasant farmers in Brazil. But there is another impact, and it's a word that we're going to have to talk about later, but it's called eutrophication. And that's the impact of fertilizer on water, on lakes, rivers, streams. Because remember, so far we've been talking about the land and the soil, but water is also impacted every time we fertilize any soil. The runoff, that soil has to go somewhere. Those nutrients go somewhere, and that impacts the system. Again, because it's a system, all kinds of components are moving all at once. So the consequences of this soil being poor is that all the plans that the government had for taking that Amazon rainforest and turning it into the new United States, the new breadbasket of the world, the issue is that what they got was 20% mortality and failure to, because the grasses can't take up the phosphorus, in part because the phosphorus isn't there, in part because they haven't evolved to do that. And they have a lot of weed management issues. And so it costs a lot, specifically about $250 to $475 per hectare in 1987, which obviously today would be more expensive. The enormous sum compared to the $70 a hectare it would cost to go ahead and tear down the rainforest. Why is it so cheap? Because of all those incentives that we talked about, government incentives that we talked about in the previous page. So the government of Brazil, the government of the United States, had a big influence into this crisis. And so we really have to consider governmental policies make a difference. Whether they be good or bad, they do make a difference. So when we're talking about these policies, they're also, when these pastures, these large swaths of land were taken up by the cattle companies that could afford the $250 to $475 per hectare, they were able to grow those cattle, make a lot of money, the peasant farmers were then had to be moved because they had to do something with all these poor people. They couldn't afford to fertilize the land, so they were moved. About 4 million residents were moved from their area where they lived to the area near the rainforest so that they could tear down more rainforest. And in fact, the cattle companies had a free source of new pasture land by allowing the peasant farmers to live their lives, tear down the rainforest, and produce more land for their cattle to be raised so that they can make more money. And the banks made money, the government was happy, again, to some extent. Of course, it caused all kinds of other issues. But the rights of the peasant farmers were impacted negatively. And so when we're talking about a system, it's not just the ecosystem that's impacted, but the human systems of government and human rights are also impacted by these governmental policies and their interaction with nature. So these subsidies, along with these subsidies and all these evictions and land grabbing that happened in the 1970s and 80s when I was a kid, when some of your grandparents were kids, when we look at the agriculture, then that was and cattle ranching as one of the big sources of issues. We also have to take into consideration the timber industry. The timber industry wanted to take those trees and make a lot of money of it, make a lot of money on those trees themselves. Now that means about 300 species of trees, only 30 to 50 were commercially attractive or could make a lot of money for these people. Now let's go ahead and drawing these as Hoovian trees. Those trees from Dr. Who, or not Dr. Who, geez, from Dr. Seuss. If we take a look at these trees and we think that the only trees that, as a logger, the only trees that are going to make us money are the black trees. Well, there's two ways to do this. We can do it in a sustainable fashion or a non-sustainable fashion. So this is a choice. The non-sustainable fashion is cheaper, and if you had unlimited land and supplies, then maybe that would be a way to go if it had no negative impact on the system. But it does. It's not sustainable, so that means in the long run you're going to end up losing. Rather than playing the long game, a lot of people do, a lot of companies play the cheaper short-term gain. And what is the short-term gain here? Well, I could just go in and take out the trees I want, not caring about the trees I don't want. Take out these trees, and let's say I take out the black trees because those are the ones that are going to make me money. I'm making cash. That's great. But it turns out that when I do it in an unsustainable way, I end up damaging the 27 trees for every one that I make money on. So for every one tree I make money on, I damage 27 individuals that I don't make any money on. That doesn't make sense. So in a sustainable fashion, you could be more careful in taking out the trees that you're going to make money on. If we look at another hectare of land, and we go ahead and start taking out these trees here along, let's say this is not a hectare, let's say this is whatever it takes, however much space is in, with whatever technology we have, this is 20 years worth of tree logging. This land represents 20 years of tree logging. Well, I can keep logging trees sustainably, trying to be careful not to hurt the trees that I don't need. And then, of course, every time I harvest, I also plant. So I harvest and plant all the way down. It takes me 20 years to get all the way to the other side of this swath of land. What do I do when I get to the end of this? Of course, it takes about, let's say it takes about 20 years for this tree to grow to a size that I can harvest. Well, I get to the end. After 20 years, I can start at the beginning again. And I just keep doing that. I just keep going from beginning to end, and then I plant as I go, beginning to end, and I could do this pretty much eternally because I kept the other trees that naturally grow in the area. I'm not bringing in species that haven't been adapted to the poor soil. I haven't done anything that would disturb the ecosystem to the point where it wouldn't be able to keep itself going. And so this would mean 20 years plus 20 years plus 20 years plus 20 years. So here we have 80 years worth of harvesting and money versus just 20 years of harvesting and money. And I think that this is not only is it sustainable, but in the long term, 80 years versus 20, for instance, in the long term, you make more money. Because if this ended up making you, I don't know, $100, well, how much money did this over here, did this sustainable system make? Well, $100 times 80, right? Well, it wouldn't be 80, it would be times 4. So $400, 4 times the amount of money could be made in the same plot of land without all the politics and disturbing of the people and disruption to all the other parts of the system. So you end up, the sustainable way of doing things actually makes good business sense as well as being better for the environment and this system, this ecosystem that we've been talking about. So here the authors make a really interesting question. They pose an interesting question. How do the value judgments implicit in the decisions reflect current political, social, environmental conditions? When we think about what we've discussed thus far, what have we really been talking about? These judgments, what values, what political, social, environmental conditions are they talking about? Well, first of all, you're talking about a political viewpoint that was based on the idea of unlimited growth, the potential for unlimited growth, ever-ceasing growth, which is a false narrative, right? You can't have unlimited growth. There's no you can't sustain that. The other idea was that this political viewpoint, and also social, both the political and the social, and each influenced each other. The political influenced the social, and the social then impacted back to political. So it ended up being this positive feedback loop where you have the political decision-making through incentives and through banks and economies in both the United States and Brazil, impacted the social by moving millions of people around in Brazil, by defining the way of thinking in Brazil. And that way of thinking then led to certain kinds of people to be elected, and these politicians and these banks, then the people became bankers, and that led to that philosophy continuing. So the social aspect, that the success of the cattle industry, the success of the timber industry, then impacted the political, because those are the people that got elected to office, and that then increased and sustained those incentives that kept the system going. So you have this positive feedback loop that just keeps feeding on itself. So this idea of unlimited growth and then short-term gain. And then there's another piece of, I think it's clear, and hopefully by the end of the year you'll have a better understanding of this. That's an untruth, and that's that the system will repair itself. That somehow this system will continue to be able to, we can tear down the rainforest. The rainforest always grows back. It's not an issue. And that these the market being the people that buy and sell things, these market systems, these market decisions are influenced by 1940s policies established in 1940s and 50s, where the understanding of ecology, the understanding of ecosystems, the understanding of systems in general was limited, and when the viewpoint of unlimited growth was at its strongest. So we've been talking a lot about dollars and cents, a lot about government and the need of the people. But there are these things that are called externalities, right? And these externalities are things that are outside the normal way of people, normal way people think, and how people are impacted outside the economy, outside those dollars and cents. And the thinking that's happened since the 60s is this idea of trying to capture the whole value of the environment, not just the dollar value of that tree or that land or that soil, but looking at the value of the land and of the forest, of nature, as something that in itself has a dollar value, has a value for sustained income, has a value for sustained existence. So the idea is that when you have non-consumptive use values, so what is non-consumptive use values? Those are things that are not going to be extracted the way that president of Brazil discussed the Amazon earlier. We're not going to take out the trees. We're not going to take out the gold and the diamonds. That's not what we're talking about. There is a value of leaving the tree where it is without taking it out. You can make money by, if you're a tour guide, you can make money by helping bird watchers find those birds, like in that movie Blue, right? You can make money by having people paid to use the land, or rent towels to people that want to sunbathe, or sunscreen for people that want to sunbathe. Paying for a documentary about the rainforest. Everybody loves a good nature documentary. Photography. People love pictures of rhinoceros and trees and toucans and what have you. People love tree climbing. And those are just a few of the many things that people would love to do in the Amazon that they would pay money for. And that has a dollar value. And possibly, if you start to consider time and sustainability, a bigger dollar value than pulling out trees in any which way you'd like. These non-consumptive appreciations or moral values, all right, this idea that things exist and that we have a stewardship responsibility as human beings, we are stewards of this land, that perhaps we should take care of this. Perhaps and save this land, either because we think there's some kind of holy stewardship responsibility, or maybe just because we should be holding this land and taking care of it for future generations, for our children, for our children's children. Perhaps we feel that our children's children should be able to enjoy the idea of polar bears and etc. These are things that we need to consider when we're talking about value of a rainforest.